No one in that building ever looked the CEO in the eye. Yet it took just one quiet sentence from a 12-year-old girl to shatter the untouchable empire of Chicago's most ruthless tech billionaire. Vincent Adler ruled Adler Innovations with cold-hearted precision. One mistake meant instant corporate exile. For years, the housekeepers kept their heads down. Cynthia, a contracted cleaner drowning in medical debt, endured his systematic humiliation to survive. Beside her stood Courtney, her silent daughter. Ignored by the elite executives, she observed everything, hiding a brilliant analytical mind inherited from her late grandfather. When Vincent intentionally shattered a priceless architectural model to publicly degrade her mother, the room held its breath. Every adult stepped back. But Courtney stepped forward. She looked the powerful billionaire straight in the face and delivered the words no one else dared to say. "You should apologize. I saw the reflection. You pushed it yourself." Ooh. Before we see how this brave girl outsmarted the elite, let me know in the comments. What time is it, and what city are you watching from right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Hit like and subscribe for more underdog victories. For years, Cynthia and her 12-year-old daughter Courtney existed only as invisible shadows within the towering glass walls of Adler Innovations. The corporate hierarchy dictated that contracted cleaners were less than human, a sentiment weaponized daily by the senior assistant Philip. He was a man who wore his undeserved authority like a tailored suit, thriving on the degradation of those beneath him. As Cynthia meticulously scrubbed the polished marble of the executive lounge, Philip intentionally nudged his leather shoe against a nearby potted plant, spilling dark soil across her freshly wiped surface. He offered a mock apology, laced with poison, sneering that someone of her social standing should be used to groveling in the dirt. Cynthia did not argue, simply lowering her head, her worn hands trembling slightly as she reached out to gather the mess. Standing near the supply cart, Courtney watched the scene unfold, her small jaw clenched so tight it ached. She remembered the quiet dignity her late grandfather Howard had always carried, a stark contrast to the pathetic cruelty playing out before her. Just as Cynthia began to sweep the soil, the heavy oak doors burst open, and CEO Vincent Adler stormed into the room like a localized hurricane. His face was twisted in a mask of pure fury, a multi-million-dollar software presentation having just crashed in the boardroom. He paced aggressively toward his massive obsidian desk, where a fragile, intricate architectural smart city model rested on a crystal pedestal. Seeking an outlet for his explosive rage, Vincent swiped his hand violently across the display. The priceless model crashed to the marble floor, shattering into thousands of jagged acrylic pieces right next to Cynthia's knees. The entire room went dead silent as Philip and the other trailing executives held their breath. Instead of acknowledging his tantrum, Vincent's cold, predatory eyes locked onto the terrified cleaner. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the destroyed prototype and coldly declared that her clumsy, worthless presence had cost the company its most valuable asset. The billionaire demanded that Cynthia drop to her knees immediately, pick up every shattered piece by hand, and beg for his forgiveness, threatening to obliterate her family's meager livelihood if she refused. The crushing weight of the elite's entitlement pressed down on the room, suffocating any remaining trace of justice. Cynthia, paralyzed by the fear of losing the medical insurance that kept them afloat, closed her eyes and began to lower her knees to the jagged debris. Before her knees could touch the floor, a small but fiercely steady hand clamped onto her shoulder. Courtney stepped out of the shadows, her posture rigid and her eyes burning with an inherited fire that refused to be extinguished. She pulled her mother back upright, shielding her from the executives. The 12-year-old girl turned her gaze upward, locking eyes directly with the most feared man in Chicago. Without a trace of hesitation, she dismantled his manufactured reality with clinical precision. She stated clearly that the shattered acrylic pieces were scattered in a forward trajectory physically impossible to have been knocked over by a woman standing 3 feet behind the desk. Courtney pointed toward the reflective glass panels lining the lounge, declaring that everyone saw his reflection when he deliberately smashed his own project because he could not handle his own failure. She refused to call him sir, stripping away his corporate armor with her defiant tone. "You should apologize," she demanded, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade. "You broke it yourself, and you want my mom to take the blame." The sheer audacity of a child exposing the CEO's fragile ego left the sycophants gasping, freezing the room in a state of absolute shock. As soon as the heavy steel doors of the basement storage room slammed shut, a freezing, deadly silence enveloped the mother and daughter. The underground archive was essentially a concrete vault designed to preserve sensitive corporate blueprints kept at a constant near-freezing temperature that immediately bit through their thin clothing. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the desolate space, amplifying their sense of complete isolation. Vincent Adler had not fired them, as termination would have been a quick mercy. Instead, his wounded ego demanded a complete psychological dismantling of the defiant child and her mother. He had condemned them to this corporate purgatory with an impossible directive. Rising from the center of the frost-coated floor was a massive, chaotic mound of shredded documents comprising thousands of tiny, jagged paper fragments from obsolete contracts and destroyed architectural schematics. Their mandate was to manually sort, match, and tape together these microscopic slivers into readable pages before dawn. It was a calculated exercise in futility, engineered specifically to crush their spirits and prove that any resistance against the elite was utterly pointless. Driven by raw panic and the terrifying looming threat of losing her job, Cynthia dropped to the icy concrete and plunged her bare hands into the overwhelming sea of paper trash. She began sifting frantically, her eyes darting across thousands of identical white strips containing disconnected letters and meaningless numbers. The sheer volume of the wreckage was staggering, and the biting cold quickly numbed her fingers, making every movement clumsy and painful. Each failed attempt to connect the microscopic text drained her remaining energy, while the freezing air relentlessly attacked her lungs with every jagged breath she took. Within an hour, the sharp edges of the stiff corporate cardstock had sliced numerous tiny cuts into her skin, leaving faint smears of blood on the white fragments. She felt the crushing weight of absolute power bearing down on her fragile existence, realizing that billionaire titans like Adler could legally torture the working class under the guise of assigned duties. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic as tears of absolute despair welled in her eyes, blurring her vision and making the impossible task even more unachievable. The heavy metallic clank of the electronic lock disengaging echoed through the vault, signaling the arrival of the senior assistant. Philip stepped inside, draped in a heavy, luxurious wool overcoat that sharply contrasted with their shivering forms. He did not offer a shred of pity as he gazed down at the weeping cleaner scraping the floor. Pacing slowly around the mountain of shredded waste, he delivered a meticulously crafted psychological blow. He reminded Cynthia in a sickeningly calm tone about her mounting medical debt, casually reciting the exact figures of her overdue hospital bills that the company's minimal insurance barely covered. He leaned in slightly, his voice dripping with aristocratic contempt, and asserted that the bottom tier of society was biologically destined to serve as the doormats for the ruling class. Philip sneered that her daughter's brief moment of bravery upstairs had only guaranteed their total financial ruin, ensuring that no contractor in the city would ever hire a blacklisted cleaner. He made it abundantly clear that Adler Innovations possessed the influence to freeze her bank accounts and seize her modest apartment before the week ended, leaving them homeless on the unforgiving winter streets of Chicago. He instructed them to keep digging through the trash where they belonged, turned on his polished heel, and exited the vault. The heavy steel door locked again with a resounding thud, sealing them back inside the freezing vacuum. Cynthia finally collapsed entirely against the concrete wall, burying her bleeding hands in her lap as quiet, broken sobs racked her shivering frame. She was entirely consumed by the grim reality that her decades of silent endurance had amounted to nothing effectively crushed beneath the heel of a vindictive empire. When the digital clock on the wall blinked to 2 a.m, the true impossibility of the punishment became fully apparent. The freezing vault offered no comfort, but Courtney refused to shed a single tear. She watched her mother shivering on the concrete floor and knew that panic was exactly what their wealthy tormentors wanted. The young girl unzipped her faded canvas backpack and carefully pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook that had belonged to her late grandfather, Howard. He had been a highly respected fire captain for the Chicago Fire Department, a man who survived countless disasters by maintaining absolute clarity in the midst of chaos. Courtney flipped through the yellowed pages until she found the specific section detailing his strict rule of scene compartmentalization. She knelt beside Cynthia, gently pulling her bleeding hands away from the chaotic mountain of paper shreds. Speaking in a calm, authoritative tone that deeply echoed the old captain's wisdom, she instructed her mother to stop looking at the overwhelming pile as one massive failure. Instead, Courtney divided the concrete floor into distinct grid sections using her own shoelaces and several spare pens. She established a systematic sorting algorithm based purely on visual identifiers rather than attempting to read the microscopic printed text. They would separate the fragments strictly by paper thickness, corporate color codes bordering the edges, and distinct watermark patterns clearly visible under the harsh fluorescent lights. Cynthia wiped her tears, drawing immense strength from her young daughter's unwavering focus. Slowly, the frantic digging transitioned into a highly efficient assembly line. They matched the jagged edges of architectural schematics with corresponding blueprints and dense financial spreadsheets with their matching ledger pages. The grueling hours bled away in a synchronized rhythm of sorting and taping their combined efforts, fueled by a silent, stubborn rebellion against the powerful executives who actively sought to break them. By the time the heavy steel door echoed with the loud sound of the electronic lock disengaging at exactly 7 a.m, the freezing room presented a vastly different reality than the one the billionaires had anticipated. Vincent Adler strode confidently into the vault, with Philip trailing closely behind him. Both men wore highly arrogant expressions, fully expecting to find the cleaner and her child weeping in absolute defeat amidst an untouched pile of trash. They halted abruptly, their smug sneers instantly dissolving into expressions of profound shock. Neatly stacked on a metal utility table were dozens of perfectly reconstructed corporate documents, categorized with pristine precision and securely bound together by transparent tape. Cynthia sat quietly on a nearby crate, her physical posture completely exhausted, but her spirit unbroken, while Courtney stood beside her with a steady, unyielding gaze. The meticulously organized evidence of their resilience struck a severe psychological blow to Vincent's incredibly fragile ego. He had engineered a flawless psychological trap, yet a mere child from the lowest social tier had completely dismantled it using nothing but raw intellect and inherited discipline. His rigid face flushed with a dangerous mix of deep humiliation and rising corporate fury as he surveyed the perfectly sorted stacks. He abruptly pivoted near their meager personal belongings, furiously searching for any minor flaw to exploit. Suddenly, his sharp eyes caught a glimpse of something metallic protruding from the open front pocket of Courtney's canvas backpack. Vincent paused, his gaze locking directly onto the worn leather notebook and a tarnished, smoke-stained fire department captain's badge resting partially exposed. He recognized the distinct heavy shape of the historic municipal insignia almost immediately. A slow, chilling realization seemed to wash over his tense features, quickly replacing his initial anger with a dark, calculating intensity. The billionaire leaned closer to silently inspect the name faintly engraved on the tarnished metal surface. A deeply malicious smirk slowly crept across Vincent's face as he stared at the inherited relic, his dark mind already twisting the honorable history of that tarnished badge into a completely new, calculated advantage. 72 hours after the psychological manipulation game began, the harsh crackle of the internal public address system echoed, tearing through the silence of the maintenance sector. The robotic voice of the central dispatcher ordered the immediate presence of the contracted cleaner and her child at the executive penthouse suite. 2 towering corporate security guards appeared within minutes, silently escorting the exhausted mother and her observant daughter into the private glass elevator that shot upward toward the pinnacle of the Chicago skyline. Stepping out onto the top floor, they were immediately engulfed by an atmosphere of suffocating opulence, where the air smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished mahogany. Sitting casually behind a sprawling obsidian desk was CEO Vincent Adler, his legs elegantly crossed, while his senior assistant Philip stood faithfully by the panoramic window like a vigilant gargoyle. Without offering a single word of greeting, the billionaire raised his impeccably manicured hand and carelessly tossed a heavy object onto the pristine glass surface of his workspace. The tarnished, smoke-stained badge belonging to former fire captain Howard clattered violently against the tabletop, the harsh metallic sound ringing out like an insult in the quiet room. Vincent leaned forward, intertwining his fingers, as a sneer of pure, concentrated contempt formed on his sharp features. He began to systematically dissect and ridicule the fundamental values that the working class clung to, targeting the very concept of heroism with venomous precision. The ruthless executive declared that individuals who willingly sacrifice their own safety for the benefit of strangers were not heroes, but rather evolutionary failures, possessing inferior intellects. He argued that the natural order of the world was meant to be dominated by visionaries who accumulated wealth and power, while those who perished in the dirt or ran into burning buildings were simply stupid pawns, incapable of ascending to the elite echelons of society. Vincent gestured disdainfully toward the battered brass insignia, mocking the fact that a lifetime of grueling public service had ultimately amounted to a worthless piece of scorched metal and a family drowning in insurmountable medical debt. Cynthia trembled uncontrollably at the vile desecration of her beloved father's legacy, instinctively reaching out to grab the badge, but the billionaire sharply slammed his hand down, trapping the relic beneath his palm. He abruptly shifted his predatory gaze toward the 12-year-old girl standing rigidly beside her weeping mother. Vincent revealed that he had thoroughly inspected the worn leather notebook left in the basement, discovering the detailed outline for Courtney's upcoming school history presentation about her family's patriarch. A twisted, sadistic smile illuminated his cold eyes as he meticulously laid out a seemingly impossible trap specifically designed to crush her defiant spirit once and for all. He issued an absolute ultimatum, commanding the child to return to this exact office tomorrow afternoon to deliver her historical defense directly to him. The rules of his cruel game were simple, yet devastatingly lethal to their survival. Courtney had to completely convince the cynical Titan that her grandfather was a genuine hero, worthy of respect, a task designed to be unwinnable against a man who measured human worth exclusively in profit margins. If her performance failed to move his hollow heart, Vincent promised a retribution far worse than simple termination. He calmly vowed to utilize his corporation's massive influence to permanently blacklist Cynthia across the entire metropolitan area, ensuring that a customized smear report would land on the desk of every major facility management company in Chicago. This corporate death sentence would actively block any future employment, effectively obliterating their only remaining path to survival and forcing them out onto the unforgiving streets. The billionaire leaned back in his plush ergonomic chair, reveling in the absolute terror radiating from the helpless cleaner. He coldly dismissed them with a flick of his wrist, leaving the young girl staring fiercely at the stolen badge, fully comprehending the catastrophic weight of the impending judgment day. The atmosphere inside the CEO's office felt exactly like a suffocating courtroom awaiting an execution. The following afternoon had arrived with a heavy, oppressive tension pressing against the panoramic windows of the penthouse. Courtney stood entirely alone in front of the massive obsidian desk, her small posture radiating an unnatural stillness that deeply unnerved the adults in the room. She had brought no index cards, no perfectly aligned visual aids, and no trembling apologies to beg for her mother's career. Her empty hands remained firmly clenched by her sides, with her right fist tightly gripping the rough charred edges of the historic brass badge. Philip leaned casually against a polished mahogany bookshelf, a cruel, mocking smirk dancing on his lips as his fingers hovered near the intercom, eagerly preparing to summon the corporate security team the moment this pathetic charade inevitably failed. Vincent Adler sat enthroned in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers while casting a bored, dismissive glare down at the 12-year-old girl, fully expecting a stammering, tearful plea for mercy. Instead of crying, Courtney took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice ringing out with a startling clarity that commanded the massive space. She completely bypassed the generic flashy tales of manufactured bravery that wealthy executives typically consumed. Instead, she transported her hostile audience back to the brutal, freezing winter of 1993, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of a catastrophic industrial building collapse on the south side of Chicago. She described the terrifying roar of buckling steel, the shattering of reinforced glass, and the suffocating blanket of toxic black smoke that completely consumed the lower levels. The young girl recounted how the emergency command center had officially sounded the evacuation horns, declaring the highly unstable structure a total loss and aggressively ordering all personnel to retreat immediately. But Captain Howard had deliberately ignored that final survival directive. Courtney explained how her grandfather had heard a faint, terrified sound coming from the deepest sector of the inferno, prompting him to disconnect his safety tether and plunge directly back into the collapsing sea of fire to search for an unknown trapped victim. She detailed the agonizing minutes that followed, describing the absolute darkness of the blinding smoke and the searing heat that literally melted his protective gear onto his skin. She spoke of the sheer stubborn willpower required to navigate through a deadly maze of falling concrete and twisted metal, driven solely by the unwavering belief that every single human life possessed an undeniable worth. Vincent's arrogant posture subtly shifted as the harrowing details of the 1993 catastrophe filled the sterile corporate air, an unidentifiable shadow flickering briefly behind his usually cold eyes. Philip's sneer faltered significantly, his hand slowly moving away from the security intercom as the gripping narrative unexpectedly commanded the room's undivided attention. Courtney did not elevate her grandfather to the status of an untouchable god. She portrayed him as an exhausted, ordinary man who simply refused to surrender his humanity in the face of absolute terror. Taking a deliberate step closer to the billionaire's fortress-like desk, the brave daughter of the invisible cleaner locked eyes directly with the most powerful man in the city. She then delivered the core philosophy that had defined Howard's entire existence, effectively stripping away the artificial prestige of the corporate elite. The true value of a person, Courtney stated, her voice echoing with undeniable authority, is not measured by how many people they stand above, but rather by how many people they are willing to bend down and pull up from the ashes. With a slow, deliberate motion, she uncurled her fingers and firmly placed the badly scorched warped fire department badge directly onto the center of the pristine glass surface. The heavy brass struck the table with a sharp, dry clack that pierced the quiet room like a gunshot. The physical manifestation of genuine bleeding sacrifice sat in stark contrast to the sterile manufactured wealth surrounding them. The suffocating arrogance that had previously dominated the executive suite evaporated instantly, and every single trace of mockery in the room abruptly fell, completely, irreversibly silent. The smoke-blackened badge lay silently on the polished glass desk, looking like a shard of brutal reality that had just pierced a room built on vain illusions. Vincent Adler slowly leaned forward, his arrogant posture completely vanishing as his eyes locked onto the tarnished brass surface. The faded engraving of the name Howard seemed to burn directly into his retinas. All the blood instantly drained from the billionaire's face, leaving him ashen and trembling as a sudden violent gasp clawed at his throat. The meticulously constructed walls of his corporate fortress began to crumble as a repressed 30-year-old nightmare violently forced its way to the forefront of his mind. He was no longer the untouchable CEO of a tech empire. He was suddenly a foolish, rebellious teenager trapped in the belly of a burning industrial warehouse in 1993. Vincent vividly remembered the suffocating terror of that night, the searing heat melting the soles of his sneakers, and the absolute certainty that his reckless trespassing was going to cost him his life. He remembered collapsing under a fallen steel beam, his lungs screaming as toxic black smoke filled his chest. And then a massive figure had emerged from the roaring flames. It was a broad-shouldered fire captain who had defied orders to retreat, searching the doomed sector until he found the trapped boy. Vincent's hands began to shake uncontrollably on the armrests of his chair as the most devastating detail of that night finally resurfaced. When the thick smoke became too dense for either of them to navigate, the captain had made the ultimate sacrifice without a single second of hesitation. Howard had unfastened his own emergency oxygen mask, strapping it tightly over the terrified teenager's face, choosing to deeply inhale the deadly, chemical-laced fumes himself to ensure the boy survived the grueling crawl to the exit. That singular act of profound humanity had guaranteed Vincent a future, allowing him to grow up, amass infinite wealth, and build Adler innovations. But it had also caused irreparable, catastrophic lung damage to the heroic fireman, sentencing him to a painful, lingering death just a few years later. The staggering weight of this revelation struck the billionaire with the destructive force of a freight train. He had spent his entire adult life ruthlessly mocking the concept of sacrifice, believing himself to be fundamentally superior to the working class. Yet his entire existence, his massive fortune, and every single breath he took were directly paid for by the blood and agonizing suffering of a poor working-class laborer. The sickening realization twisted his stomach into violent knots. He slowly looked up from the scorched badge to see Courtney standing before him, her defiant eyes perfectly mirroring the unyielding spirit of the man who had literally pulled him from the ashes. Vincent felt an overwhelming wave of absolute paralyzing nausea as he fully comprehended the horrifying magnitude of his own monstrous behavior. He had spent the last 24 hours systematically torturing, humiliating, and brutally threatening to destroy the struggling family of his personal savior. He had locked his benefactor's daughter and granddaughter in a freezing vault, ruthlessly mocking their medical debt and treating them like disposable garbage. Philip, completely oblivious to the catastrophic internal collapse happening beside him, let out a condescending scoff and took a confident step forward, aggressively demanding that the security guards immediately drag the worthless cleaners out of the building. But before the arrogant assistant could finish his cruel sentence, Vincent raised a violently shaking hand, silencing the loyal sycophant with a single desperate and breathless command to stop. The invincible titan of industry lost all remaining strength in his legs. He heavily collapsed back into his luxurious executive chair, no longer a powerful king upon a throne, but rather a broken, pathetic man drowning in an inescapable sea of his own making. Vincent tightly buried his pale face deep into his trembling hands, letting out a ragged, agonizing moan as the crushing weight of profound, irreversible shame entirely swallowed his once impenetrable ego. The collapse of an empire does not always come with a deafening crash. Sometimes it is merely the quiet, shattering sound of the arrogant ego of a man who once considered himself a god. The profound revelation inside the penthouse offered no simple path to unearned forgiveness. Haunted by an unbearable, crushing guilt and the undeniable exposure of his foundational hypocrisy, Vincent Adler could no longer maintain his ruthless, tyrannical facade. Within 48 hours of that fateful confrontation, the broken billionaire formally submitted his unconditional resignation directly to the stunned board of directors. He voluntarily stepped down from the towering corporate throne he had aggressively built on a toxic legacy of deceit and manipulation. The sudden power vacuum at the pinnacle of the company immediately initiated a swift, merciless corporate purge. Philip, the ultimate parasitic sycophant, who had enthusiastically thrived on inflicting daily misery upon the working class, found his executive security access abruptly revoked. He was summarily terminated without a single cent of severance pay or professional recommendation. The arrogant assistant was forcibly escorted out of the grand lobby by the exact same security guards he used to command, finally tasting the deeply bitter humiliation of being coldly discarded like worthless garbage onto the concrete pavement. Before completely relinquishing his vast corporate control, Vincent utilized his remaining authority to execute a final, legally binding act of genuine, practical atonement. He permanently established an irrevocable multi-million-dollar educational trust fund entirely in Courtney's name, ensuring her brilliant analytical mind would never be stifled by poverty. Simultaneously, the bewildered executive board ratified an airtight permanent contract, officially elevating Cynthia from an invisible contracted cleaner to the prestigious role of Director of Facility Management for the entire corporate network. This unprecedented promotion came complete with premium lifelong medical benefits that permanently erased the suffocating financial terror that had plagued their family for years. Stepping out through the revolving glass doors of Adler Innovations later that week, Cynthia and Courtney no longer walked as invisible, fearful shadows. They walked side by side, with their heads held immensely high into the crisp, refreshing Chicago air leaving the toxic corporate fortress behind them forever. The extraordinary courage, unwavering resolve, and sharp intellect of one marginalized child had effectively cleansed an entire poisoned corporate ecosystem. Looking back at the gleaming, towering skyscraper one last time, the 12-year-old girl softly remarked to her tearful mother that the tallest and most intimidating towers were always the most fragile when they were constructed upon a fragile foundation of lies. Courtney's spectacular triumph proved definitively to the world that pure, unyielding truth remains the ultimate unstoppable weapon capable of shattering any deceitful empire. Her incredible journey serves as a powerful reminder to every silent, overlooked worker that manufactured elitist power can never permanently crush the enduring, radiant dignity of a brave, unbending heart.